This program is sponsored by the Agrarian Trust. Agrarian Trust is charting a new path forward for the land trust movement. They're advancing an innovative and robust model of land ownership in which agrarianism, social and environmental justice, community well-being, and the earth itself are all seen as fundamentally intertwined. They're doing this by helping regenerative farmers and ranchers to secure long-term, affordable leases. That helps to strengthen local food systems and to transform community relationships to the land across the country. Visit agrariantrust.org to learn more. This program is sponsored by the Greenhorns. Listeners to Down to Earth might enjoy the newly released 6th edition of the New Farmer's Almanac, a literary miscellany written by and for working agrarians. This year's volume is titled Adjustments and Accommodations, and it's full of essays, poetry, and images that explore how people are facing challenges and uncertainties on the land. Learn more and order your copy at greenhorns.org. From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. This is a program about regenerative agriculture and the many different paths people are taking to fix a broken food system, restore soil, and mitigate climate change. And today we're talking to somebody who's doing all of those things, Cole Mannix. He's from a ranching family in Montana that goes back over 150 years, and he's working on models for meat distribution that are more resilient, humane, and ecologically sound than what the corporate meat industry tends to offer. Welcome, Cole, to Down to Earth.
Thanks for having me, Mary Charlotte.
So you are from a fifth-generation ranching family that's been in Montana since the 1860s, and there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of controversy in the media about the meat industry and its environmental impacts and its health impacts. What did you see growing up, and what are you seeing in the present day in Montana? Do you see ranchers doing conservation practices? Are they treating the land well? Do you see a lot of overgrazing, land degradation, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say that I see practices from the ranching community that are all over the board. I think the first thing that strikes me is that even the poorest managed operations are still not yet under pavement, and that's a positive. And even the poorest managed operations still have a measure of habitat. So I think that ranching in general leaves a lot of opportunity for wide open spaces and ecological wholeness. I think that there's a tremendous amount of good stewardship out there. And I think that regardless of whether people sell into what you might call niche markets or regenerative markets, there's a great deal of pretty darn good land stewardship in the ranching industry as I look around me in this state. You know, the industry is so fragmented between the actual fields to the feeding stage, to the processing stage, and so even folks that are still very much plugged into the commodity system, often there's really good stewardship happening at the ranch level.
What does that look like?
I would say that it looks like being thoughtful about livestock impact and rest. I would say it means being very thoughtful about streams and water holding capacity in the soil. You know, that comes back to rest with plants. If you have a relative absence of bare ground to the maximum extent possible, if you have good diversity in the plants, if as much as possible you can preserve native range, you know, it's important for that soil to be able to capture and hold the water that it does have. And from a management perspective on the ranch, that has, for the most part, to do with grazing management. It also has something to do with how you manage noxious weeds. It has something to do with how you, if there is cropping involved, what does your cropping system look like? To what degree have you been able to get artificial inputs such as pesticides, chemicals, or, you know, artificial fertilizer out, and make sure that the inputs are coming from the land base itself. And you know, it has something to do with bringing fire back into the system. And so in our neck of the woods in the Blackfoot Valley, where my family's ranch is, prescribed burning is something that it's a big effort right now, primarily coordinated by the Blackfoot Challenge, but it's often happening in coordination with either the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management.
What's the Blackfoot Challenge?
It's a collaborative watershed organization that has been around now for about 30 years in our valley, and it kind kind of evolved organically to originally around our valley was looking at the Bitterroot Valley, which is just south of Missoula, Montana, not very far away. Missoula is about an hour's drive downriver. And then south of there, the Bitterroot Valley, the Bitterroot River, had just experienced a tremendous amount of development pressure. So the folks in the Blackfoot, local people, the ranching community, the various agencies that were active, the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the Nature Conservancy, groups like the Trust for Public Land, they were basically asking the question, how do we avoid the kind of fragmentation that landscape has seen? And so they had a lot of community discussions, back in the early 90s. And the first conservation easement actually had gone into the Blackfoot Valley in the 1970s. That was our state's first conservation easement. But also we have now, partially because of that thought process, 160 acre zoning in the north end of our county where you can't purchase a parcel smaller than that. That comes with its own challenges for local housing, but it has kept our landscape pretty darn wide open.
That's interesting. That's like the exact same amount of land that was given during the Homestead Act period.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, and certainly there still is some subdivision at that 160 acre level, which is, from my perspective, not particularly desirable. But the pressures of growth have been lessened on our neck of the woods because of the combination of conservation easements and this zoning, and then also because as an entity, the Blackfoot Challenge, which is a nonprofit, has just really been a community clearinghouse for everything from how do we live with large carnivores. Grizzly bears and wolves are definitely back in force on that landscape, especially over the last 20 years. And so that questions like that, questions about, the Blackfoot River has a whole bunch of boats per hour going by individual access point. And so what does, stewardship long-term from a recreation standpoint look like on the main river? So it's a clearinghouse for a lot of kind of overlapping natural resource, wildlife, agricultural questions that the community faces.
Do you feel like there's some consensus toward good stewardship? Is there a lot of kind of battles going on in meetings and things like that?
I think that there is a lot of consensus around good stewardship and the fundamentals of what that looks like. From the perspective of soil health, from the perspective of leaving enough water in the main river, not just for agriculture, but for wildlife, for fish. There's a lot of emphasis on the health of the tributaries that are feeding the main Blackfoot River and those riparian areas as, fisheries. I think there's a lot of consensus that whatever people might think about the degree of presence of large carnivores on the landscape, today and where that's going, they're part of the landscape. And what can we do to minimize conflict? And what can we do to kind of, keep the agricultural base intact and at the same time kind of accommodate the changes that we're experiencing in terms of growth and people wanting to live and move there? And how do we, in a post-timber economy with a lot of the mills struggling and the timber industry not being what it used to be, which is what used to be a very big part of the valley, how do we capitalize on the recreational opportunities that there might be, trail systems, wilderness areas, that sort of thing?
How is your family's ranch dealing with large carnivores, with bears and wolves and stuff like that?
We participate in a carcass pickup program that the Blackfoot Challenge has organized. That just means that during calving season, there is a truck that comes around regularly to the ranches, and so any calves that die or cows that die during calving season, instead of having bone yards and bone piles on each individual ranch, they can become an attractant. The dead stock is taken off-premise and composted at a site along Highway 200, kind of the main two-lane highway running through the valley, on a site that the Department of Transportation owns. And that really it sort of just invites less trouble. There's also a program, we call it range riding, although that might call to mind like big wide open landscapes where you're herding up on public lands and you're using herd impact, you're using the grouping of animals and intensive management to essentially just limit depredation and stay out of high sensitivity areas and have the group effect of animals together in one big mass deter some predation. But in our case, it really is more about the Blackfoot Challenge and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks using telemetry to understand where wolves are in proximity to summer country, where animals are out grazing, do a lot of communication with the ranchers, helping quickly to identify if there is a kill, or if you find a dead animal, was it likely caused by a large carnivore, or was it more about the animal died and then was eaten on? There's a lot of electric fencing and various tools like that for calving yards and stack yards. Basically the range riders are a conduit for that information about how to, if you want to do electric fencing, like what's the right context and what's the infrastructure and how can you get it funded. Oftentimes there's at least cost share programs to help with those kind of investments. And so, it's that, and then it's us just learning kind of over time, where are the high density predation areas that we need to pay more intensive attention to over the course of the growing season when animals are further away from the home base. And, it is a little bit more just intensive human presence.
So let's talk about the economics of the meat industry, which is something that you're involved with on a number of levels. From a rancher's perspective, what are the pressures? What are the pressures on the rancher? Like where do they come from economically?
Well, the pressure comes from essentially input costs that are rising faster than the gross revenue from livestock.
What kind of inputs are you talking about?
So I'm talking about what it costs to raise grass hay, what diesel costs, what a swather costs. Just a few years ago, we bought a new swather. I think it was $120,000. Now the price tag is $200,000. That's a really steep jump in a few years that is not reflected. It's not paralleled by a jump in livestock prices for sure. So what it encourages across the industry is basically larger and larger operations that kind of consolidate together. And it also can, I think, that commodity system can basically just drive a focus on pure short-term bottom line rather than is the soil either maintaining or improving over time, and how are the riparian areas, and what does the it decreases people's bandwidth to work with wildlife agencies and nonprofits and to think about the things that you don't actually sell. It decreases your bandwidth to think about those things, and you really have to just focus much more on your banknote.
We were talking the other day and you kind of called it a race to the bottom.
Yeah, that's right. I think that good land stewardship is ultimately about thoughtful human intervention in complex ecological systems. That takes skill on the part of those people, and it takes just a lot of time. And I talk about eyes per acre, meaning like eyeballs per acre, that observation, making a plan, observing the results, making tweaks, re-observing. That constant process is what good long-time stewardship looks like. But the race to the bottom is that you try to begin cutting costs to stay in the black, and oftentimes those costs are labor. And labor is a cost, but it's also one of the main assets you have to manage land well.
Because those are the people who are the eyeballs who are looking at the land.
That's the talent, the passion, the tradition, in some cases the long knowledge of a place. And when you lose that tradition, you lose those families, you really do lose something that's hard to replace quickly.
It seems like in every sector of society in our world, certainly in our country, whether it be, agriculture and ranching or media or, pretty much anything else, it's all dominated at this point by monopolies or near monopolies. It's like this consolidation that you were talking about that makes it really hard for small and mid-sized businesses to exist. And it seems like that's what you're looking at in the meat industry, in the beef industry.
Yeah, I think that's right. The industry has been geared for a long time to producing as much as possible at the lowest price for the customer. I'm not actually sure that that's happening, but that has been the industry's stated goal. I think that the customer is seeing some rising prices, and the ranches are seeing stagnant, relatively stagnant prices over time, and there's quite a bit of margin going to that bottleneck, to that, the hourglass bottleneck between the top and the bottom. And so there's a lot of money being made. It's just mostly not by the people who are actually stewarding land.
Right, right.
The other thing I would say about that, I think that good work, that's part of where we get meaning. And the kind of work that increased technology, we have some amazing technologies now that we didn't have certainly before. And that it just keeps getting better. But what that means is more time at a computer, more time plugged into gadgets. Oftentimes people find less meaning in that, but particularly if they have an interest in agriculture and ecology and animals. The kind of work that you do managing livestock is very different from the kind you do crunching numbers on spreadsheets and working with various apps.
Well, the whole question of, what do you do about living in this consolidated system? And yeah, there's some good technology and some apps that might help you in some ways, but they may not address the root of the problem, which is money is getting siphoned off at the top, and the people who are actually producing the food aren't making that money, and they're really pressured. And one of the potential solutions to that is having more small and mid-sized businesses instead of these huge conglomerates. And I want to talk about that in a moment. But before we talk about that, I'd love you to walk us through sort of the process of, like, you've got a ranch. Your family has a pretty big ranch that's a combination of owned and private and public leases and things like that. So you have these animals, they get slaughtered and turned into meat. What next? I mean, where does it go? Like, what does the market look like for that? Wholesale, retail, restaurants, all those kinds of things.
I think that the idea that farmers markets and that scale of selling food to people can sort of compete with the industrial model that's a pretty partial picture. I don't see that ultimately being the way that most people get most of their food. And I really value the farmers market context, but I think this idea of agriculture of the middle, where we have more medium-sized businesses that can still capitalize on some economies of scale. I mean, if you build a meat processing plant, there's so much that goes into, for example, the planning of where can it be sited, and the water system in terms of water in and the water system in terms of water out. And at the end of the day, you've got to run enough animals through a facility to pay for those big expensive pieces of equipment that are required in order to comply with food safety law, right? So economies of scale make some sense. But once they get big enough, you end up with these systems that might be fine when they're working, but when COVID happens, they require this huge 1,000 head a day or more of livestock into that plant in order to work. And when there's an interruption in the chain, you end up wasting animals at a massive scale. You end up wasting product at a massive scale.
Why?
Because that plant, in order to pay its note, has got to be bringing animals in the door. And all of a sudden, a plant shuts down because its workforce gets COVID. And there's no place to go with those animals, and they're slaughter ready. And it essentially really quickly becomes more expensive to feed and house them. And people are cutting their losses by dumping product. So the system can be efficient when nothing goes wrong, but there's not many redundancies. And so more medium-sized businesses make a lot of sense to me. Not simply from the perspective of redundancies, but when you operate at a medium-sized scale, you have a chance of knowing the employees who work there, caring about them, investing in them long-term, caring about their family context. Are they in a living wage situation? That's how relationships are built. When the beef industry in the 1980s went from your average grocery store butchering the meat in-house with its own team of butchers to this boxed beef system where carcasses are broken down in very large facilities. They're boxed, they're sent to the grocery stores, and the grocery stores mostly lose their skilled labor in the meat department, and they become more, they just receive meat and they put it out on the shelves. And there's a lot lost in the customer's relationship with that meat department, the communication that happens across the counter. I think that that's primarily how people gain trust in something, is with that in-person interaction. And the more we get away from that, the more we go to traceability means more blockchain. It means third-party labels. And I'm not so sure that that's actually how a better, less commoditized, more connected food system comes about. I think it's about people who know the landscapes that they really care about and want to invest in the stewardship of those landscapes because they have an idea of where to find the products of that landscape.
And there's also, and I just have to say this, the whole question of efficiency seems never to include externalities like environmental impacts, health impacts, human and community impacts that have real social costs and real taxpayer costs.
I think that's right. Yeah, you measure increases or decreases in efficiency based on a set of variables. And those variables have not included the human or ecological elements to date. And it's frankly just very hard to put all of those things in an equation, but they certainly have been left out thus far. And so there's nothing wrong with efficiency in itself, but it's about how many metrics are you really including. And we've not been including land stewardship or rural communities or human health or ecological health in the calculus.
One of the things that I think is also really important for people to understand who aren't really involved in this industry is that when you are even a significant sized ranch or even in a ranching cooperative, and we're going to talk about cooperatives in a moment, is, you start selling wholesale, for example, to a chain supermarket or a Whole Foods or a restaurant chain or something like that, you lose your ability to set prices. They have so much more control than you have. Explain to us how that works.
Yeah, if you, it takes between 2 and 3 years to get a beef animal, for example, market ready, from the time that animal is born until the time that it can be harvested. And so if you are making a relatively large commitment to a wholesaler of a given volume of meat per week or per month, and you've built your whole system, perhaps you've jumped through some hoops to get certifications and to build some ranch management plans that comply with their standards. And then here you go and you begin selling, and pretty quickly they've got a lot of control over you, because if you want to maintain that account, you may have to comply with either the price not going up with inflation or the price perhaps going down as they search out other options and try to improve their margins over time. And so my own family has a small meat brand called Mannix beef, and we sell to 350 individuals who buy from us regularly. And that is a far more resilient market for us than any given wholesale account. Those folks are buying from us because they trust us. Many of them have visited the ranch, or they've met us at the farmer's market, multiple conversations over the phone or email, and they've invested in knowing something about us. And so they are less price sensitive because they're in it for more than the price. They want a fair price, but they're in it for more than the price. And so the back and forth dialogue between those folks helps us to communicate what that more is. It helps us to understand what they really are looking for, what their questions are. So it's hard to build that direct market because it's hard to communicate with 350 individuals versus one wholesale client. But it is a pretty stable way to build a business. If it takes time, but you can rely on it. And you might lose a customer here or there, but you may gain 3 for every one you lose.
And I would think that the challenge of then really building more of those is ever more difficult, because it's one thing to meet 350 people at the farmer's market, but then let's say you want to get up to 5,000 people.
That's right. So you face all these questions about shipping is expensive, and there's a lot of packaging materials, especially with meat, that are wrapped up in that. Is home delivery viable? You ask yourself that question. In some cases, there's a brand called Walden Local in the Northeast where home delivery has been that's their model, and they've got a very dense population, geography-wise, to sell to, and to do home delivery.
Because they're in the Northeast, yeah.
Right. And, in our case, that's going to be much more challenging to build out. At the moment, we sort of split the difference by running the families program runs a route to a couple of different cities, to our east one weekend, and then the next weekend we go to our west. And we meet people at drop-off locations, and that's how they get their products. But still, that's another step up in terms of the effort it requires of the customer. Another couple steps up. It's so easy for people to go to Costco, and pretty much anything that they could want is there. And so overcoming the activation potential that it takes to gain somebody's attention, and they're going to prioritize going to get their products. It's hard for a direct-to-consumer model to compete with a Costco. And so, it's not as if there's no place for wholesale and retail at all. But I sort of think similarly about wholesale and retail as I do about a meat program, which is just more medium-sized, more locally controlled businesses would be better than a massive box store system that we sort of have invested in as a society.
Yeah. You're listening to Down to Earth. Our program will continue in a moment, but we wanted to let you know about some terrific Quivira Coalition in-person and virtual workshops that are coming up. There's an ongoing monthly webinar series being produced by the New Agrarian program. It's called the New Agrarian Toolkit, a webinar series to dig deep and level up on a variety of helpful topics. There will be several compost-related workshops happening in New Mexico, Santa Fe, Ocate, and Taos, as well as a camp-out workshop happening in Ozona, Texas, on biochar and soil health. You can find out more about all of these at quiviracoalition.org/events, and Quivira, Quivira, quiviracoalition.org/events. And now back to our program. Well, so your life, it's interesting. I mean, you grew up on a ranch, 5 generations of ranchers. You probably saw your life going in that direction, but you ended up going in a somewhat different direction in the sense that you went to the meat distribution business. You worked for a group called Salt of the Earth Ranchers Cooperative some years ago. Now you're with the Old Salt Co-op. And all of this seems to be about like making different models, perhaps more resilient models, that regional mid-size model that you're talking about. Talk about how your trajectory has gone and what you've learned and what you're doing now.
Well, I went to work, my first job out of school was working for this cooperative, and I knew nothing about the meat industry other than my family's ranching context and a little bit of our own very local meat brand. But we joined a cooperative of about 120 ranches that we had got to know those people through a holistic management network called Ranching for Profit. And it was sort of a west-wide rancher group that wanted to sell their product. They wanted to sell domestic grass-fed beef, and they wanted to get a better value for their livestock and to diversify their market options. And the idea was that we could aggregate coal cows and bulls. These are animals that have dropped out of the breeding supply chain, either because the females became open or lost a calf, or because the bulls were no longer viable.
Can you just tell us what you mean by an open cow?
Yeah, so an open cow is just a cow that did not breed up for that season.
So basically infertile.
That's right. Or just didn't get pregnant. And that's about 20% of our U.S. beef supply comes from cull animals. And so we thought this was an area we could enter into the marketplace, and we found a packer after a lot of work that was small enough to work with a small group like us, but large enough to give us some decent costs of processing and economies of scale in Greeley. And we started using that packer, and we found one large buyer that was buying semi-loads of trim, just cut up lean meat, and putting that into a product that they called the Omnivore Burger, and that was out of Kansas. And so for us, it was a way to begin at a little bit of scale, aggregate livestock, process in Greeley, and we were relying on the grass-fed claim that was gaining traction nationally at the time, and we were relying on being a domestic source of grass-fed meat because so much grass-fed meat comes from other countries. So it took us several years to begin building that out, and we finally had everything going, and in a matter of a few months it was all gone. We lost the packer because he died, the owner died, and the grinding facility in Fort Morgan had to be sold. And almost at the same time, COOL, country of origin labeling, was repealed federally, and so we were now sort of not able to distinguish a domestic product in the way that our value proposition depended on. Our main buyer lost the majority control of her company. They took a different direction with their products. And so that was definitely an example of a not resilient system. And for me, we were still processing meat that I almost never saw because it was in Greeley and I'm in Montana. And it was stored in a warehouse outside of Denver. And it didn't feel to me like local food, more intimate relationships with customers. It still depended on arm's length, third-party labels to try to say, this is different than commodity. And so when we began building Old Salt Co-op, the idea was we don't have to be a huge scale company. That's not our aspiration. And we want to build a company that ensures that the producers can control the price that they're getting for their livestock. And if the company overall is successful, that some of those profits will go back to the producers themselves. And so Old Salt Co-op ended up becoming an LLC that works like a co-op. And so the majority of our board are producers, and the minority of our board are workers, so that they have a long-term stake in the company. And then the private investment money comes from a third class of preferred interest holders. And they get their money back first, but they don't govern the company. And that was really important to us in terms of building something that producers could ultimately benefit from if it was successful and make the core decisions on, especially with not necessarily the day-to-day operation of the business, but the core decisions in terms of what will we use to measure our impact on the land over time, and what will we pay up front for our livestock. What's that kind of living wage? And the worker component was critical too, because there's so much in a meat company, but from the butchery team to the marketing team, the folks that are focused on the financials and the accounting and e-commerce, there's so much that is outside of the core expertise generally of ranchers. And so we wanted those people to have a long-term stake in the company. And so we decided, given that there are not very good custom processors, it's not that there's not good custom processors, there's not good availability of custom meat processing in the state. And so we couldn't just work with a co-packer. We decided we needed to own our own meat processing. And so we invested in a small custom exempt plant that we began just last July, about a year ago. We took ownership, we began operating it, processing 4-H animals and wild game, and getting our butchery team kind of up to speed with a traceability system and teaching ourselves what it costs us to process a given animal. And we're working that facility towards USDA inspection by the fall, when we'll be able to process meat both for our own brand, but also for other ranchers and farmers in the region who are trying to move their products to wholesale and retail and direct to consumer. So Old Salt Co-op owns the meat processing component. And then we also wanted a way to connect with customers in more than just a label. And so we started a little restaurant in Helena, kind of as a way to test the market and also as a little bit of an income stream as we're in startup phase. That was October of 2021. And so that the community showed out in force for that right away, and that's only grown. And so it gave us energy. It is an income stream that is profitable and helps us to, survive while we're right now building these facilities, and we're burning money before we get to that profitability stage. But that little enterprise is both a way to engage customers. It moves 500 pounds of ground beef a week, and test in the market. And we're also investing in another restaurant with a butcher shop inside of it. Hopefully that will launch this winter. And that will be a place where we can retail in this little community that has 40,000 people or so. And it'll again be a way to promote the brand, to get our name out there, to actually host people. And to me, those relationships are what local food is really about. We sell meat online in bundles and subscriptions and some a la carte options. And that's how we're trying to build a direct-to-consumer base. And at the moment, people in the Helena area, they can place an order. It's ready within 24 hours. They can pick it up at the processing plant. Every Friday, we deliver around town. We also do a little pop-up butcher shop with a food trailer that we have where people can come and buy meat and they get a free brat. And they get to meet us and we get to visit with them. And then we're also holding a food and music festival. And that's another way we're trying to engage, the folks in Bozeman and the folks in Missoula and the folks in Helena that care about Montana. They live here for a reason, and a lot of that reason is the outdoors and wildlife. And so we're trying to find ways to build relationships with them, to care about these rural areas, to invest their money there through the products that they buy, and also to teach us, what are they looking for? What are their core questions?
This is a really interesting model because it's in a lot of ways vertically integrated, and it has a quite unusual governance structure that you talked about. Did you guys come up with this? Is this modeled on something that other people are doing?
We formed as a formal cooperative with the help of the Cooperative Development Center in our state. And then we learned as we went, there's, I would say, a bit of a dearth of fiscal and legal advice when it comes to cooperatives, especially multi-stakeholder cooperatives. There's a lot of cooperatives that focus on grain or cooperatives that focus on electricity. But our model involved restaurants, and it involved meat processing, and it involved all these different layers. And so basically we got the advice that a cooperative was not going to work for us. And we kind of custom designed the LLC structure that we are living in now with the help of an attorney that I've come to know over the years and really trusted that he understood our value set. And so we built this really not with other precedents in mind. It was trying to blend what we liked about a cooperative with the flexibility of an LLC.
I mean, the big question that you're asking, that I'm asking, that a lot of people are asking is, we want, for reasons that have to do with preserving land and wildlife and air and water and, the world around us to be truly sustainable and regenerative, we want small and mid-size focused food system. The model that you were doing at the Old Salt Co-op is one example of that. I was wondering, how do you see, if you do, a path toward a really nationwide food system that is small and mid-size? And I mean, that would mean on some level busting up big conglomerates. Do you see that there's a path forward toward that?
Well, I'm such a non-expert in that space of there. In a lot of ways, there already is the law that justifies minimizing consolidation, or at least cutting it off at a certain threshold. And there's been a lack of political will to enforce that law, and sometimes a lack of resources for the agencies that's supposed to do this enforcing. I don't focus on the policy side as much because I just think that I've found that I'm more fulfilled and more energized by looking at the community that I know in Montana and just asking the question, how it's possible even now to build medium scale food and food processing that can survive. It's not going to make anybody wealthy if it's done right, but it's going to return enough to all the different parts of the supply chain that land stewardship can happen and can flourish. And regardless of what happens at the policy level, whether it never changes or whether we really get some powerful leadership that recognize the importance of medium scale food and agriculture, these little medium-sized businesses that find a way to make it will be critical to build upon, for other people looking for a way to do it. And if we experience some future massive shocks to the system, whether those be climate related or social upheaval, these little businesses that employ people and provide some stability, not only for the people buying food, but for the people who work in them, that's what we have to build on. So I don't know what to say about the outlook. I just have a sense for, regardless of the outlook and the forecast, what should we be spending our time and energy, or what do I want to spend my time and energy on?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You talk a lot about land and about relationships, and I saw that you studied not only biology, but also philosophy and theology. And it really feels like there's a bigger dimension to this conversation that includes all of things that's really important to talk about. Like, okay, the goal of a healthy food system, as you say, it's not about getting rich. It's about having enough. And that's a really different outlook. Talk more about that and sort of how you came to that.
Well, the holistic management encourages people to have a holistic goal. You know, a business has to be profitable to survive over time. No margin, no mission. And so that's a critical component. But our goal as a family is to be profitable, like we have to be, but for our family to be managing this ranch for more generations in the future. And that means that we really need to think about the long-term ecological trajectory that we have as a business. We also want our community, the little K through 8 school. We have one bar in town, probably the best bar in Helmville, where people go and gather, and that's sort of the center of the community. A community hall, a fire department, a rodeo that we host every year in the fall. And we want to employ people in the community, and that we also want to employ family. And labor is a cost. And we could be a more profitable ranch overall by moving to a model that required less labor. But we've sort of consciously chosen that labor is both a cost and an asset. So we balance the need for profitability with the desire to employ people. And that's why you need a holistic goal. And I think that was the trajectory for me of just being interested in philosophy and theology. Like, what are you really after? What will create a fulfilled life? What provides you meaning? How do you do justice to all the various different people and animals and all the different things that matter if you're going to have a system that lasts? So I think my interest in theology and philosophy was just like any of us who have an interest in what does it mean to live a good life and to be fulfilled? What are you really after? And ultimately it led me back to, during graduate school, I was reading Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson, and I was having lots of dialogues with my fellow students who were interested in agriculture and food, and there was a growing negative perception of livestock and meat in the world, and it kind of drove me back to an interest in agriculture, where I came from. And we had a little bit of opportunity to travel and see a couple of other countries and how their agricultural systems worked, and I was interested in social justice and realizing that social justice often means cleaning up our own acts so that other people can live well where they live.
Yeah, because we interfere in other countries' agricultural systems in ways that really don't benefit them under the phrase feed the world.
Yeah, I think feed the world the world has to be fed. But any one ranch or farm or country that decides it's their job to feed the world, I think it's too big for their britches. And it's just, we can't know what's right for other places. What we can know is, are we losing or gaining soil here? Do we have a healthy set of watersheds here or not? I was recently at a meat processing conference hosted by Colorado State University in Denver over the winter. And the talk was by a very well-known scientist on global emissions. It was GHGs. And that's really been one of the Biden administration's laser focus of. And they, from the conventional beef perspective, they kind of love that, because if you really just use GHGs as the metric, then the global grain-based meat production system is how you minimize GHGs. You have animals that are younger rather than older. When they're ultimately slaughtered, they're larger. They get growth hormones. They have intensive rations. But what GHGs does not measure is the loss of soil down the Mississippi. That's an emission, and it's maybe the most important emission. And so any frame can be too small for the problem. And if you minimize GHGs in the short term, well, that's actually not it's not a big enough aspiration. The aspiration has to be that we're maintaining or building soil and fertility, and that we're not losing our microbes. And so when you look at the system, once again, back to that holistic perspective, when you look at the whole system, GHGs is just one thing, a critical thing, but just one.
I can't also really believe that if you grow grain in a place that is using inputs like fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and all that kind of stuff, and using tractors and using diesel and then harvesting it, which takes a lot of energy, and then shipping it to a feedlot, that's emitting fewer greenhouse gases than animals that are roaming on grass and eating what's right in front of them.
Well, for me, it's basically, I don't even need to know I don't even need to do the study in depth because it's been done in depth. And I'm not the expert to all the different sources that go into that and who controlled it, and how good are the studies that were being presented to us this particular day at CSU. But I can basically just, without even asking which argument there is right, I can, by looking at what was counted in that equation and what was not counted, more importantly, the externalities, I can know that it was too small a frame. Again, like the emission that we don't count is the loss of microbes and the loss of soil down our rivers. And that's more critical than anything else.
Right.
And it just doesn't show up in that equation. And so I don't trust what ultimately the message was, which is we need to keep, making animals more genetically efficient. We need to keep we need to be as efficient as possible with these big plants that don't restrict the flow of livestock across borders, and that basically are just all about production. And the goal there was feed the world, and I think that is, again, a too big for our britches goal. I think the goal should be produce good food, and as much good food as you can without draining your bank account, your ecological bank account. And, regenerative, that's the new word, but, ecology is regenerative by nature. The whole thing is built that way. It's just that, for the most part, our agricultural system has not been that. It's been extractive, and so we have to find ways to work within this ecological context that we find ourselves in. And in the best scenarios, with the best managers and all the right tools, you actually are seeing land that can improve in fertility over time and be productive. And that's the holy grail. But it's not, I would not say that that's common. That's when everything aligns perfectly, and things are not aligning perfectly at scale. So we have examples we can point to, anecdotes where it is working, and I think there legitimately is land that is increasing in fertility and still being incredibly productive. So that's awesome. But that's by far the exception, and we're going to have to massively redo our entire food system to achieve that at some scale.
And it seems like ultimately that's the only option.
Yeah. At some point, even if you took the CSU model as, okay, that we got to feed the world, I mean, at some point we're going to run out of the kind of energy we're using right now. And so I don't really see another option rather than to build back our systems that are more resilient and closer to home and more redundancies, and to just measure on these particular ranches, these ones that are supplying our brand, are they going in the right direction ecologically? Do they have a succession plan, and do they have family that is coming in behind the folks that are aging out? And are our customers able to feed their families at a fair price? Like, those are the questions we can answer for our company. I think we have to be able to answer those, but I don't know how you answer that for the meat industry.
Yeah. The Old Salt Co-op, your company, is hosting a food and music festival this summer. It's June 23rd through 25th at your family's ranch in Helmville, Montana. And I think it's unusual. I was reading the webpage about it. I mean, in the sense that there's not only music, but like top flight chefs and speakers and things like that. Tell us about this festival.
Yeah, I'm really, I couldn't be more excited or scared for trying to put on an event like this, but we're trying to have as many as 2,000 people a day out to the ranch for 3 days and treat them to whole animal wood-fired cooking over a 40-foot fire. The first night would be hogs, and the second night will be beef and lamb, and the third brunch will be goat barbacoa from a gentleman named Eduardo Garcia out of the Bozeman area. So the food, just anytime you bring people together around food and drink, it's gonna be festive. But we really want this to be a place people go to network with other people who care about some of the same things: resiliency and sustainability in the food system, large landscape conservation and wildlife populations. So we have sprinkled in throughout some speakers, some wonderful poets. A woman named Deborah Magpie Erling is going to tell Native American ghost stories around the fire on Saturday night. And an author that I'm in love with, David James Duncan, is going to speak about the upcoming release of his Sun House masterwork. And so there's elements of kind of dealing with the question of livestock, meat, environment, nutrition and health. Diana Rogers is a well-known speaker in the space with her Sacred Cow and her Sustainable Dish platform. Nicolette Hahn-Nyman also speaks to many of these issues, and so she'll be present. And so it's a festival that is after a little bit older demographic, I think, maybe than your typical music festival. Late 20s all the way on up, and families, and we'll do pasture walks in the morning where people can hear a little bit about this particular ranch and this valley. And there's a panel of conservation partners, so the Blackfoot Challenge nonprofit, and Wild Montana, the Wilderness Society, Montana Master Hunter, the Association of Conservation Districts. These folks will have a chance to share how they work with the ranching community on all kinds of different projects, from fish and wildlife to conservation easements and agriculture. So it'll be a blend of festive and contemplative.
It sounds quite amazing, and people are welcome to camp, and if they don't want to camp, they can stay in nearby towns that aren't too far away and just spend the days at the festival.
Yeah, that's kind of the unfair advantage of the Blackfoot Valley, is that it's this beautiful little rural landscape, but it's not far. It's less than an hour's drive from Helena and about an hour from Missoula. And so people can, whether it's RVs or tent camping or staying in town and making day trips out, kids under 10 are free, and the meals are included in the ticket price. And I think once people are there, there's also a general store with a bunch of amazing makers from around the region. A woman named Kate Havestad has a company called Range Revolution. She's making baggage and luggage out of regenerative leather. And there's all kinds of cool brands that are finding ways to, make a living with really cool products in their little rural communities. So those makers are coming from across the Pacific Northwest.
For more information, people can go to oldsaltfestival.com. And if they want to find out more about the Old Salt Co-op, how do they do that?
They go to the same place, and it's all built into the same webpage ultimately. oldsaltcoop.com is the main site.
Cole Mannix, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me, Mary Charlotte. It was a pleasure visiting with you.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth-planet-to-plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.